My best friend stole my belongings, so I decided to get revenge. My friend Dan and I have known each other since the fifth grade. To be clear, he is into men, and I am a woman. We continued to be friends into our adult lives as we began building our lives with our respective partners. I got married in 2012, and he got married shortly after me. In early 2015, my husband and I bought a house, while Dan and his husband rented a house. However, shortly after that, I began dealing with feelings I had ignored for many years and came to the realization that I like girls and needed to leave my husband. I want to clarify immediately. My current husband is an excellent person, and he didn't do anything wrong to me, as many people in my life for some reason assumed. His family, whom I also loved very much, moved into that big house with him so he wouldn't be alone when I left. He was always surrounded by loved ones. He wanted me to be happy and honest with myself, and he eventually found his own love. So there are no hard feelings between us. At that time, I told Dan that I needed to move out and live independently. Since they were renting a huge house that they couldn't afford, they offered to let me move into one of the rooms and agreed that I could stay for a few months for free until I got back on my feet. I was incredibly grateful and moved into that room. However, after a few days, they came to me and asked me to start paying for the room immediately because Dan had developed health problems and was temporarily unable to work. Of course, I agreed, as the conditions were quite reasonable. A few weeks passed without any problems, and for the first time in my life, I experienced single adult life, because since college, I had been in a relationship with my former husband. That feeling of freedom was simply unreal. Shortly after that, they decided to rent out another room in the house. And lo and behold, it was rented by a girl roughly my age. Let's call her A. We discovered that we had the same birthday on Valentine's Day. Even our pets' birthdays matched. We immediately hit it off and became platonic adventure partners. On weekends, we went to bars, looked incredibly hot, and attracted the attention of all the pretty girls. It was incredibly fun. I have the best memories of that time. I know what you're thinking, and no, we were always and remained just friends. However, that was exactly when Dan started to get jealous and also grew angry because the new roommate not only spent a lot of time with me, but was also messy. For example, she would leave an empty wine bottle in his bathroom — he was a teetotaler — or bring people home from the club late at night. I admit my fault in that I was involved in that once as well. When Dan said he didn't like it, I stopped bringing anyone home. However, Dan didn't know that on that particular night, I hadn't gone anywhere with her at all, and that the wine bottle wasn't mine. So in his eyes, we were both guilty, and he didn't tell me this directly, which would have given me a chance to defend myself. That was when the atmosphere in the house became tense. I continued to pay my rent on time every month, as any normal person should do. By that point, I had lived there for about 3 months. Then Dan moved in another roommate along with her teenage daughter, a middle-aged woman he worked with. They lived in the basement, and this woman was a real tyrant. That's what I'll call her, the tyrant. Then he brought in another roommate, E, who was temporarily sleeping on the couch and was supposed to take A's room, as A was soon forced to move out due to the controlling nature of that crazy lady. Dan wrote me a note informing me that I had to move out within 5 days. I was young, I didn't know my rights or the laws, so I was stressed and didn't know what to do. I had no way to move all my things and no place to go. A few days later, I received a message from Dan. Hey, the tyrant told me she heard you and A discussing that I am legally required to give you 30 days notice to vacate. But that's not true because we don't have a contract. This was complete madness because we literally never talked about that, and I hadn't even researched my rights. So that conversation simply never happened. I decided that since there was no contract, I had no grounds and no choice but to move out. I told my sister about my situation. She told our father, and he came to my rescue. He showed up at the house with a trailer, ready to move my things even without me asking. Can we please take a moment to admire my dad for being my knight in shining armor in a situation where I was ashamed and afraid to ask for help? Dan specifically left town during my move out, but his husband stayed behind and took the opportunity to get wasted. He was drunk out of his mind, but as usual, he played the good guy card and offered to help me carry my things out, stumbling over his words, and later regretted it. When I actually agreed and asked him to carry a box outside, I moved everything out of the room. But I still had a lot of items that wouldn't fit in the car, so I stored them in the garage. A few weeks prior, they had held a garage sale, and since I sell new and vintage items online, I had a lot of inventory that I also put out for that sale. Several weeks after the sale, the two-car garage was still completely packed with items from the sale, as if nothing had sold at all. Therefore, while trying to clear the room within the time frame they set, I took the remaining personal belongings that didn't fit in my car, including about a quarter of the clothes hanging in the closet, and put them together with the garage sale items. I warned Dan's husband that I couldn't take everything and left the things in the garage, but I would be back for the rest soon. He very politely agreed and said there was no rush. About a day after I left, I received a message with photos of the carpet in my former room, showing cat urine stains. Dan blamed my cat, was furious, and said I had to pay for it. However, I explained to him that I knew exactly when they went into my room. While I was at work, their cat would go in there, then they would leave without the cat and close the door. The cat would urinate in the room because it was trapped. I would come home, open the door, their cat would bolt out, and there would be a puddle in the room. That's how I knew they were going into my room and that it was their cat. They cleaned one spot once at the very beginning when I told them about it, but later I stopped mentioning it because they caused a huge drama about cleaning back then, and I didn't want to look hysterical or start more conflicts. Earlier, there was an instance where I ordered breakfast to go and left it in my room until I returned home. Someone entered my room, left the door open, and their dog went inside, swiped the food off the dresser, and ate it. It made me angry because I consider personal boundaries and privacy important, and people shouldn't be constantly snooping in my room. I was afraid this created tension. So, when their cat urinated in my room for the second and third time, I just cleaned it as best as I could and covered it with a rug because I didn't want to look at it. But I know for a fact that my cat doesn't have accidents because I've had her for several years, and it has never happened. I explained that I knew it was their cat, which they didn't even want themselves and were trying to pawn off on others. They bought and got rid of animals just like they spent money to fill a void. I said that if I had been given more than just a few days to move out, I would have gladly shampooed the carpet. I even offered to come back the next day and bring my father's carpet cleaning machine. But Dan wouldn't listen. That was when he told me I was no longer a welcome guest in his home and that our 15-year friendship was over. About a week passed, and I had a day off to collect my remaining things. I started sending Dan messages like, "Hey, is anyone home? Can I come pick up my things?" At first, he ignored me, and then he started blocking me on various social media platforms. About 4 days later, I decided to just show up at the house with my girlfriend to get my things. We pull up. The garage is open, but I can clearly see that my things are not there at all, while the garage is still packed with their untouched items from the sale. The only trace that I had ever lived there was a lone pink hanger lying on the floor. I go to the front door, ring the bell, and see the Tyrant peek her head around the corner. I tell her I've come for my things, and she replies, "Call Dan." I respond, "I already called, and he's ignoring me." She slams the door in my face, closes the garage, and I go back to the car and call the police. Of course, silly me, they use the good old excuse, "This is a civil dispute, blah, blah, blah." So, naturally, they couldn't help. At that moment, it sadly dawns on me that my things are likely gone. I see Dan's car in the driveway with the sunroof and windows open, so I know he's home, just hiding. Trying to cheer me up and get a bit of revenge, my girlfriend took a half-full cup of an old Frappuccino that was in my car's cup holder. It wasn't that old, it was just hot out, and it had been in the car since that morning, and poured it through the sunroof of his car. But that was only the beginning. I returned home broken, mourning the items I left behind, including several pieces of clothing that my grandmother had sewn in her youth and passed down to me. I was so depressed and hurt that after a few months, I began doing research. I studied local rental laws and realized that what he did was completely illegal. In Minnesota, you are required to give a tenant 30 days' notice of eviction if the tenant pays rent monthly, regardless of whether there was a contract or not. Furthermore, they are required to store my belongings and return them to me within approximately 60 to 90 days after I move out before disposing of them. It became clear to me that they were completely in the wrong in this situation. I would never in my life throw away or touch someone else's belongings, especially if that person was given only a few days to move out. In my mind, the option to take someone else's property didn't even exist, regardless of what I thought about that person's actions toward me. I was angry, but the icing on the cake was when I decided to use my girlfriend's social media to check their Facebook pages. And lo and behold, I found photos of Dan literally wearing several items of clothing that belonged to me. But wait, there's more. I checked the pages of people in their circle and see a photo where the Tyrant's daughter is wearing things that were mine. And then I check E's social media and see her wearing a t-shirt that my younger sister gave me for my birthday. All these items were the ones that didn't fit in my car. I was absolutely livid. It was obvious that they had rifled through my things, taken what they liked, and disposed of the rest. Dan made it clear our friendship was over, and I promised myself that if I couldn't get the friendship back, I would at least recover the damages. Part of me still hoped my things would be returned, but this was the final straw. I started by researching the small claims court process and sent official demand letters requiring the return of my items, which they ignored. I began building the case, messages, photos, and all information vital to the process. They ignored all my letters, and eventually I was given a court date. I went to court, expecting them to argue with me, and of course, they didn't show up. Everything was against them: illegal eviction, missing items, and evidence that they were wearing my clothes. It was all there, and they literally had no arguments in their defense. I came to court so prepared that I valued all my sales inventory at garage sale prices, using the Goodwill Donation Valuation Guide, which was much lower than the actual value. The judge saw that I was prepared and more than reasonable and awarded me the full amount of the claim, about $3,000. A small victory on a long road. A year passes, and contacting Dan is still impossible because he has blocked me everywhere. On social media, I see that they have moved out of the house where we all lived, probably to get away from the Tyrant, who even by their own account was terribly despotic. Eventually, I managed to trick Dan's husband into answering a call from a hidden number, and I confront him about the bill for my things. He declares, "You will never get a cent from us." Oh, that's when it all really started. Before that, I was wavering and couldn't decide what to do next. But after that call, I realized I wouldn't let this go. I thought only of the items my grandmother left me and all the inventory I had invested in to support myself. Getting my way would be difficult, but I kept returning to the thought I am not going to lose both a friend and my belongings. If the friendship is truly over, then I am definitely getting my things back in the form of money. The next step was wage garnishment, since he wasn't paying. But I hit a dead end. The garnishment documents kept being returned to the court as undelivered. Since I didn't know where they lived now, I couldn't start the garnishment process. When the certified letter was returned to the court for the third time, a clerk, I'm not sure of her exact title, called me and explained that since all previous letters had been returned, she didn't want to waste my time and money on court fees by sending another. I explained the situation to her and that I didn't know their address, and she sympathized with me. I mentioned that in some court papers or county records, a neighboring town was listed next to their names, and I assumed they had moved there, but I didn't have a specific street address. We said goodbye, and it felt like the end of the road. A few minutes pass, and this woman from the court calls back. She says she dug around and was able to find their updated address somewhere in their system and gave it to me. I was like, "Joan, you are my savior." I had read on a self-help site for small claims that court employees cannot assist with any such information. I think this was likely outside Joan's duties and perhaps not even in accordance with the rules of her position. This woman literally saved the situation because without her, I would have been stuck right there. Finally, they received the documents notifying them that I was initiating the process of garnishing their wages. And then, bam, they file for bankruptcy. Since the initial court judgment, they had continued to rack up debts from loans, bills, purchases, and so on, entirely in line with their usual lifestyle and spending habits. They were originally counting on filing for bankruptcy if and when I figured out where they lived and tried to start the garnishment. Naturally, this meant I had to dig and figure things out further. This time, it was with the bankruptcy court, which is much less clear to an ordinary person without a lawyer than the small claims system. They mistakenly believed that by filing for bankruptcy, they would wipe out the debt to me. However, that works for things like unpaid cable TV. They didn't read the fine print stating that court judgments in cases of malicious intent do not qualify for this. I found out that I would have to refile the claim in bankruptcy court to challenge this and prove that Dan took my things with malicious intent. I gathered all the evidence again and prepared to defend my case in court. I filed all the necessary documents without the help of a lawyer and received a hearing date. Right before the first day of court, the creditors' meeting, their lawyer called me, trying to intimidate me. He claimed that what actually happened was this. Supposedly, the landlord, the owner of the house, showed up and decided to do some spring cleaning. She allegedly saw extra things in the garage and donated them to charity and was ready to testify in court, meaning I wouldn't be able to prove malicious intent. He suggested I drop the case, and at that moment, I was literally shaking. My voice trembled, but I stood my ground and told him I wasn't falling for it. I had all the evidence that they were wearing my things and that the garage was packed with everything that didn't belong to me. The lawyer knew this. He had a copy of my claim, but he still tried to bulldoze me. I had never seen the homeowner the entire time I lived there. So the version where she suddenly showed up exactly during the week I moved out and started touching and moving someone else's things was completely implausible to me. I refused to back down, and the day of the creditors' meeting arrived. I showed up in my cutest business-style, legally blonde look. When Dan saw me walk through the doors, he looked like he was about to soil his pants. This meeting wasn't mandatory, but I wanted to let him know I wasn't going to back down. Essentially, nothing special happened at the meeting, but I filed my claim in bankruptcy court as the next step. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I was firmly intending to see it through. A week or two passes, and I receive another call from their lawyer. This time, he is completely different. He wants to reach a settlement. He offers $1,000 to end it all. I need to think about it, I say, and then I refuse because I had already undervalued my items and the amount of the claim to look reasonable in the eyes of the judge. Then he offers $1,000 immediately, and then payments of $150 a month for 4 months. I let him know that, in my opinion, a $1,000 immediate payment wasn't necessary, and that my goal wasn't to put them in excessive hardship. But he confirmed that this was their offer, and I agreed. 4 years later, I finally won, and the realization that they had to admit defeat after all the promises of, "We won't pay you a cent," meant that it was finally all over. I received all the payments, and attached to the last payment was a note with an apology. This money didn't bring back the important items from my grandmother, but it came at a time when I was going through a very difficult period in my life. I was struggling with depression and was forced to take unpaid leave from work for reasons unrelated to this case. This money literally helped me keep a roof over my head at the moment when I was down, so it couldn't have come at a better time. I handled all of this on my own, without a lawyer, and I still miss our friendship very much. In the end, I think Dan behaved this way because of the pain caused by my new friendship. Looking back, I truly believe he probably thought that everything in the garage was stuff I didn't care much about, since it was originally intended for a garage sale. This entire situation could have been resolved with simple communication, but he didn't give me that chance. We haven't spoken since that last letter he attached. although I would gladly make amends if I had the chance. Perhaps it is more about justice than revenge, but I got it anyway, and I did it in a pencil skirt. To clarify, yes, technically I agreed to a smaller amount, but it is still a victory for me. Most of the inventory and clothing I bought literally for pennies because I worked at a Goodwill thrift store and had a discount. I definitely preferred to receive a payout than spend the time and effort selling those things. The more expensive items I effectively got full value for, and the ordinary everyday items without much value I valued at Goodwill rates, which was still much more than I paid for them. Therefore, I was much happier to take a smaller payout than spend hours photographing, listing, and selling items online. In the end, I definitely came out ahead in this agreement. Well, thank you for listening to this entire story until the end. I look forward to your thoughts on it in the comments. Also, check out our previous videos, which you can see right here. And be sure to subscribe to the channel if for some reason you haven't done so yet.